This third discussion session in our year-long program on small-scale PPPs. This is a program that we have launched at WAP earlier this year, with the first session on January 19th about the definition of small-scale PPPs for our purposes for this program. And we had defined them as predominantly subnational projects characterized by their modest financial investment. Small-scale PPPs offer significant socioeconomic benefits and can attract local private investment, including from SMEs and local financial institutions. We felt that those were important attributes to be always taken into consideration as we discuss the small-scale PPPs in this program. We are proud that we have UNECE, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, that is our partner in this effort. And hopefully, if everything goes well and all the approvals are obtained, we will be able to publish a joint report on guidelines for small-scale PPPs later on this year. We also have with us the Toyo University program, and Professor Yu Namba will soon be introduced by our moderator, Jacques Follin, as well as the international, the Istanbul PPP Center of Excellence, which is headed by Dr. Eyüp Vural-Aydin, and who is also a partner with us in this effort. So without further ado, I will introduce Jacques. Jacques Follin had a long career, but most recently CEO of Aéroports de Paris International, and Jacques is the chair of the airport chapter within WAP. He reminds me that there are no small-scale PPPs in the airport field, but then again, I think that in our latest conversations, he has been saying that perhaps there is, because maybe new fuel stations, and he will talk better about it than I do, maybe those will become available at airports through PPP programs. Jacques, the floor is yours. I will stop here.
Well, thank you, Ziad, for your kind introduction. Well, for everybody, my name is Jacques Follin, and I will be very happy today to serve as the moderator for today's session. So welcome to our fantastic team of panelists, and to all our online attendees. I think they are joining progressively this discussion on the web. Today's discussion is for us a significant step forward in our exploration of small-scale PPPs. We will discuss the potential solutions to the challenges this venture encounter, from funding complexities to expertise gap, risk management issues, legal orders, and all other. I think we have a lot of issue to discuss today to find way to make actionable strategies for addressing the small-scale PPP projects. So today we have a fantastic team of panelists. So I would like to start with the challenge for me, which is pronouncing the name of the first one. So I mean, please, I apologize. So let's start with Yekaterina Samarvichiene. I think I'm correct. So now I'll say Yekaterina, which is easier. Yekaterina has over 25 years of experience in public finance, strategic planning, and public-private partnerships. Since 2009, she has led the National Consultancy Center focusing on public investment and PPPs. Her expertise lies in managing public investment programs, conducting cost-benefit analysis, and assessing risks. Previously, she held managerial roles in Lithuanian ministries, focusing on strategic finance management and national development programs. Yekaterina, you have a master in geophysics and certification in business administration and PPP from prestigious institutions. I won't mention them. Then I will, I'm French, so I will continue with Professor Yunamba. Professor Yunamba, you're a professor in charge. You're leading the Toyo University PPP School in Tokyo. And you have more than 15 years of experience in PPP. And you have a special experience in small-scale PPP, as I understood that in Japan, a lot of small-scale projects have been conducted. You are an active member of WAP, and you've been collaborating for many years with UNICE. You have a master's degree in PPP and a bachelor degree from Towson University. Am I correct? I hope it was correct. Now switching back to Martin Finnegan. Martin, you are Managing Director of Caledonian Economic and Share of Tyree Renewable Energy. You are a renowned expert in public-private partnership within the education sector. And your work spans Scotland, Asia, Latin America, almost the entire world. And your focus has been on infrastructure solutions to enhance social impact. At Caledonian Economics, you advise governments on PPP transaction. And in your role with Tyree Renewable Energy, you've been developing partnership model where revenue from community-owned and wind farm support educational, social, and cultural developments on remote Scottish island. Am I correct? Then we have Nasser. Hi, Nasser. You're the founding and managing director. You are founder and managing director of Concept Realization. Am I correct? I hope so. You have over 29 years of experience in PPP, covering strategy, project preparation, transaction, and monitoring. You are a member of the board of directors of PIF's Kingdom Health in Jordan. And at WAP, you share the social sector PPP chapter, and you are a member of the MENA chapter leadership team. Thank you, Nasser. We have also David. David Dodd. I mean, unfortunately, David has an issue, and it will be only on audio, but he will be there. David is an international opinion leader in sustainable economic development, disaster recovery, and public-private partnership, and climate adaptation. David has been working everywhere. He's been working in 47 states on 4 continents. David, you're still missing one continent. You'll tell me which one. He served as Dean of the University of Oklahoma Economic Development Institute, and is founding CEO of the International Sustainable Resilience Center, a strategic partner of WAP. Thank you, David. David has an expertise in all areas of economic development and economic resilience. He is a certified economic developer, fellow member, and honorary life member of the International Economic Development Council. Thank you for being there with us, David, although we won't see you. And today,
thank you, John.
And today we are honored to have Ziad Hayek on board. Ziad is known as the president of WAP, but Ziad has 42 years of diverse experience in investment banking, corporate strategy, technology, public policy, and government relations. He was nominated for the presidency of the World Bank in 2019, and previously he held positions such as vice chair of the United Nations Working Party on PPP and Secretary General of Lebanon's High Council for Privatization and PPP. Ziad board membership span multi-sector, including company, banks, university, NGO, and tech startups. He is also a member of the U.S. Council of Foreign Relations and a presidential candidate in Lebanon. That's the reason why you wear a tie today.
That's right.
Correct?
That's right.
Thank you, Ziad. Thank you all for being there. I think we will be an excellent set of panelists today to overcome the obstacle and unlock the potential of small-scale PPPs, to drive sustainable developments. So, dear panelists, I just strongly encourage you to actively participate in today's session, sharing your perspective, ideas, and questions. And so thank you very much. I will also invite all the attendees to actively participate in today's sessions. Your input is highly valued, and encourage you to use the Q&A. There's somewhere a small a small tab, Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. So feel free to use it, and we will answer your question at the end of the discussion with our panelists. So now I would like to start the discussion with our dialogue with our panelists. And I would like to start with two questions on the funding and investment challenges. They are key in the case of small-scale PPPs. So let me start with the first question, which is, what innovative financing mechanism and strategy can be implemented to attract investors and bridge a financial gap for small-scale PPP projects, particularly in sectors where return on investment may not be immediate? Who wants to start with this wonderful question? Nasser, let's go.
Sure. I think, first and foremost, we should look at like who would not be interested in financing, given their small scale, given that they're not going to be sovereign sponsored, that typically at the sub-sovereign level, and that they are going to be small ticket, then that's going to primarily exclude the project finance banks and the international banks. Now, when we're talking about modest numbers, it may not sound very innovative, but some of that can actually be funded on balance sheets, so mainly basically from corporate finance. Now, that's to the extent it's a relatively small number, and it is financeable by the entity that it has the financial means to actually finance from its balance sheet. On the other hand, you can always break down the project into its component parts and look at different financings for different components. So typically a project will have an infrastructure, a building dimension to it. If that's a few $1 million, perhaps you can go to builder financing. And that may not be 15 or 20-year financing, could be 7 or 10-year financing. And we've seen this, for example, done on dialysis projects, which are, of course, small-scale PPPs, where the dialysis provider would go to a builder and enter into what's called a build-to-suit type arrangement, and then lease the building from them for a period of, say, 7 years or 10 years, depending on that period. Same can apply with equipment. You can lease the equipment. And you can always get working capital financing for the operating parts. So two things there: either look at the balance sheet as a means of funding, because the big project finance institutions may not be interested, and at the same time look at how you break it up into even smaller parts and then different financing mechanisms for each one.
Professor Yunamba?
Well, thank you. Well, when we talk about like Japanese experiences, we do not have like that much issues in terms of like financing these smaller scale PPPs, because Japanese PPP market is predominantly domestic market and the financing coming from within. But when we look at the, let's say, more developing countries, developing market, it's completely a different story, because a lot of financing coming from the MDBs, and they are not equipped to finance in a local, subnational, or smaller scale PPPs. So I would say like it really depends on the markets. But in Japan's case, let me slightly talk about like the innovative way of financing it, or support funding the project is the way to utilize the public asset that is not necessarily the core project service itself, but to utilize, but by utilizing the public asset that is attached to it, or that is to or next to it, or that is like supporting it, so that it can really support the revenue stream of the project, and that will make it much easier, and also to help to increase the what do you call it, like ridership or usage of the facilities. And that is one way of us using the PPPs to finance or fund the project.
Ziad, you want?
I would, I think, I mean, there are many issues with funding that I think it's a bigger subject than, well, let me say it differently. I think that the current mechanisms for funding small-scale PPPs are really limited. And they're especially limited by bank financing, because most of the time, in most countries, when you have a small project, you're not necessarily going to go to the World Bank to finance it, or to capital markets to issue bonds or anything like that. You're going to be looking at your local financial institutions, so typically your local banks. And the problem that we have, and that we all need to figure out how to solve, and also I think will be an issue for our program this year, is eventually working with the Bank of International Settlements in Basel to see how we can get banks to be able to fund PPP projects without them taking all the amount, 100% of that financing in reserves, which is currently the case in most cases. So if a bank is going to take 100%, reserve 100% of the value of the loan it is making, becomes very costly for the bank, and therefore very difficult. So this is an issue that needs to be resolved. We need to understand that, or we need to help develop eventually some investment funds that are looking to invest in smaller scale PPPs. And we at WAP are working on creating such a fund, hopefully, because one might think that these are very risky projects, but I think that through diversification, just like venture capital funds or other funds, private equity funds do, we may be able, through diversification, to get some level of attenuation of the riskiness. Clearly, also working with governments to create programs that support SMEs, and maybe government, if not full funding, because otherwise the project doesn't make sense as a PPP, but at least some partial funding by the government, or some partial guarantee programs that help de-risk the projects. These are things, I think, that are not just a single project element. These are global policy elements that we all need to work on, and hopefully this program this year will take us towards that.
Thank you, Ziad. Maybe Ekaterina, Martin, up to you.
Okay.
Ekaterina.
Yes, I would like to say a couple of words, and in order to better understand our situation. I'm from Lithuania, and it is the country which 30 years ago did not have financial market, or private investors, or private service provider. So we're in the situation of underdeveloped market, plus all our projects are mainly municipal projects and national projects with a quite low value of investment, from 8 to 9 million euro. So it's the typical daily problem and the daily project for us. And we try not to consider it as a challenge, but to see it like a regular situation and think how we can deal with them. And what we understood from our short experience, that is not the unique instruments or whatever will help, but the stand-alone small-scale PPP project will always be extremely expensive for both parties and challenging. for public partner because of the high costs of competence and expertise to develop the project, and run the selection for private because it is the very high entrance cost to develop the unique model and to come to new market and to understand how risk is shared and what are the regulation. And also there are two types of projects. In one case, we need only to cover the financial gap and try to minimize it by various means. In other case, we have the only one buyer, so we have to cover the entire project cost when we have the public services like a kindergarten, school, or whatever. And here we're dealing on the decreasing of the entire costs of the project from the whole life cycle. And here we also need different approaches for one and for another type of the projects. But the solution in our case lays in the attempts to reduce the costs of the single PPP project development, trying to introduce the longer perspective, the reliable plan, the transparency plan, how the state or municipality plan to use the PPP for the private investors. In our case, in our discussion with our market, it was always placed on as number one, this perspective and this understanding to which extent the unique models will need in the further life. It is reducing the costs and it helps very much to have the low proposal costs for the PPP, in the small scale PPP.
Well, thank you, Ekaterina. Martin, you're advising governments. I mean, what is your view on the financing mechanism and strategy to be implemented?
Well, I think Ekaterina may have been reading my notes actually, but anyway. I mean, I think there's a
it was first.
there's a fundamental thing about the use of the term PPP, and PPPs as we know them are it's a business of scale. So when we're talking about small scale PPPs, we're immediately kind of swimming against the current in terms of scale, and for exactly the reasons that you said, Ekaterina. It's basically the high fixed costs of entry for government and for investors, and then the high transaction costs. And sort of extend that to the question of, well, what do we look for when we look for value for money? The sort of standard approach to thinking about value for money in PPPs is sort of thought about from the ground up. You have to, the sort of perceived wisdom is you have to create a big project, because it's only by creating a big project that the classic calculation of sort of risk-adjusted discounted cash flows adds up. So you look for big projects, and then you build big projects into big programs, because that creates a bit of replicability and efficiency and whatnot. And then you build that up into a big pipeline, which sort of plugs into your national fiscal policy and infrastructure investment policy. And I think when you start asking the question, how do you get smaller PPPs into viable deals? My view is that you have to start by sort of saying, okay, well, really, how do we think about value for money? Because that old risk-adjusted cash flow thing doesn't really add up. So you start by thinking about what do we actually mean by value for money, and that picks up the point that I've heard you talk about very eloquently in the past, Ziad, about value for people and value for future generations. And I'm not going to expand on that just now, but it's something that I suspect I may well come back to later in the discussion. So I think that's there's one point there, which is how you think about value for money and how you create scale around that question. Then I'm going to give you one specific response to the specific question about financing. And the financing question is a particularly interesting one in small countries like Scotland, like Lithuania, for example, and like Uruguay, where I worked a few years ago. And the particular financing situation in Uruguay was that we were trying to launch a program of schools that looked very much like a kind of traditional UK PFI, PPP type of thing. But they were very keen to mobilize the local financial markets to finance that, rather than just go to the big financial institutions. And they had some quite solid pension funds, some institutional investors within the country. And what they did there was work with, I think it was Inter-American Development Bank and CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, I think it translates as. And the Development Bank effectively did a wrap for a debt fund that the local investors invested in, and then that debt fund was managed by CAF Asset Management Bank. So that is a little example is perhaps a slightly different approach that could be taken to mobilizing local investors to invest in PPPs. To say creating a wrap where where the wrap is provided by experts, but the capital itself comes from relatively small scale local investors. So there you go. My time is worth.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. David, I mean, do you have any message to give about this financing mechanism and strategies that can be implemented?
Yes, thank you, Jacques. Like Ziad, I have a background in finance and development finance, and it's always been a real challenge. But there are ways, innovations that could help. I deal in climate adaptation resilience. Only 4% of total climate adaptation goes to total climate investment goes to adaptation. 96% goes to carbon reduction, which is great, but we have to increase that 4%. So we've developed some technologies that can, in partnership with WAP, that can provide a real return on investment for private sector investors who wish to invest in disaster risk reduction. And there's also, in the US, there's a movement now to provide a fund that would provide guarantees for a certain percentage of investments that go toward making infrastructure more resilient. In other countries, it's in developing countries, especially, as we all know, it's especially difficult. But there are ways to utilize the technology we have now, and with AI, it's going to be even more incredibly important to be able to show investors reduce risk. And I come from economic development, and economic development is all about small scale PPPs. $1.5 to $2 million for infrastructure. The way they do it in the developed countries is somewhat unique for PPPs, because the public sector invests up front and the private sector repays the public sector through increased tax revenue and economic activity. But those often run into snags because of the fixed cost of putting together a PPP of any kind. And those are where we still need some innovation. We need some to think outside the box. And I hope that the purpose of this, as we all know, was to try to develop new ideas and new innovations to make small PPPs more viable. And certainly in the case of making infrastructure more resilient, existing infrastructure, that's often entails a small PPP. But how do you, number one, show a return on that investment? And number two, how can you reduce the fixed costs so that these things can be financed? I think there are a lot of ideas out there, and we're hearing some of them today. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Well, thank you, David. I have another question, but maybe you could answer. There's a question about the private investment in small scale PPP projects. The question is, how can governments and financing institutions incentivize private investment in small scale PPP project? And this question is more particularly in the case of economically weaker regions. I would say low-income countries, for instance. That's my point. We do consider it as an issue to find private investors for small-scale PPP project in low-income country. I mean, would like to answer. Maybe, I don't know, Martin, you have experience. I mean, let's start backwards here.
My view is it's all about transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
That, if investors don't have confidence in the systems of government, if they don't have confidence that that government will keep their side of the bargain, government at whatever level that happens to be, and conversely, government doesn't have confidence that they're going to be treated fairly and properly by the partners, then there's no deal. Or if there's a deal, it's a very expensive deal.
Yeah, they want to have their investment secured. I mean, do you have any ideas? I mean, Yekaterina, Nasser?
Maybe the basic things were already touched in the previous discussion, and there are not many possibilities to do that, and always it is connected to the deeper and stronger involvement of the state participation and the state financial support. If you would like to boost the region or to invite the investors to pay the attention for the less developed region, you will always need the additional government financial support, and unfortunately it move you to another distribution of risks and another financial model. But in our case it works. Also, we try to introduce another model as to look at the development in the wider sense, in the wider picture, and give the private investors the PPP project in the region as an incentive, with the additional possibility to use the public assets, as the professor was mentioned before, to generate additional incomes, and also to boost the other economic activities in the region, and in this way to compensate for some extent the initial investments. But it is only in the very early stages, and probably Martin will know much more and comment about such experience. I know that in Scotland you use this scheme, so yeah.
I think it really depends what problem government is trying to solve, actually. So if it's trying to solve the problem that financing is just simply not forthcoming, and the scale of developers that are being invited or that are interested in this kind of project is too small, that they don't have the balance sheet to be able to fund it, then there are the usual things government can do, like have like a tax concession, a tax break. Maybe they can motivate some higher levels of local employment and so on. It really depends what's the driver behind it. So if it's because the project has marginal feasibility, you can make the feasibility a little bit better, improve it by giving certain tax breaks, giving certain credits. For example, if it's an environmentally friendly project that is going to contribute positively to the environment, then you can do that. If it's because financing is just not available, what we've seen in some countries is the setup of infrastructure development. Now, I have a lot of views about these infrastructure development funds, because by and large, they all get set up and then they suddenly have the same mandate as your normal commercial project financing banks, which for me defeats the object. Because you don't need more players. There's usually, typically in these countries, enough liquidity in the market. What you need the infrastructure development banks that are set up, the national ones, to do is come in and deal with the gaps that exist in the market. So to the extent there are risks that government cannot possibly keep, and they need to pass them on, but they're too big for the small developers, that the infrastructure development fund comes in and bridges that kind of risk taking, which then enables the private partner to be more competitive and therefore be able to offer a better value for money solution. So I think there's a whole myriad of things, but the crux of it for me is actually look at what is the problem that they're trying to resolve.
Thank you, Nasser. Maybe Professor Yunumba or Ziad, do you have any comments on how to incentivize the private investment in small scale PPP, and especially in weak regions, economically weak regions?
Jacques, I believe David has his hand up and he would like to say something.
Okay, thank you very much. David?
Yes, Jacques. two things come to mind. First is one of the markets that we really feel is probably the most advantageous for small scale PPPs relating to climate adaptation resilience is environmental, social, and governance and impact investor funds, which combined have some $19 trillion worldwide to invest. And so looking at low-income countries, that is really a part of what they are there for. That's the first. The second is foundations, public-private philanthropic partnerships is our friend who's the head of the PPPP, as they call it, chapter, Max von Ambrath, is really championing. And the first exercise they did was on using the philanthropic to fill gaps in making places more resilient, which was a thrill to me that they were doing that. And that can really be effective in filling the gaps that inevitably will be present, especially in low-income and developing countries. So those two mechanisms could really come together to solve some of these issues, especially with small PPPs.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that we can now jump to the next set of questions in relation with capacity and expertise gaps. I have a question dedicated to this issue, which is, how can local authorities develop knowledge management and data strategies that are specifically tailored for small-scale PPP proposal, while ensuring alignment with local requirements and effective government oversight? Which is a tricky question, but I think it's a major issue when talking about small-scale PPP. Would like to start, Nasser? I see you.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I think it's absolutely crucial when it comes to small-scale PPPs that government really gets its act together on data. I mean, the way you've worded the question with knowledge management and so on, it's actually all about the data, because for the project feasibility to be tested, there needs to be a very good amount of reliable data. And what we typically see is that government is not very forthcoming with finding its data and making it available. And then you end up with all the bidders trying to find the same kind of data. And of course, when the prize is big, it's a huge project with, big rates, returns in absolute terms, the bidders can feel motivated to do that, especially if it's not a very long list of bidders. But when it's small, and then you start to count the effort that's going to be involved in getting you there in the end, given that there is competition, if that data is not made readily available, you're really not going to see these projects see the light of day. So it's absolutely crucial, and it kind of really starts from home, that when you're looking to develop these projects, search for the data as if you as the government are going to do it yourself, so that you gauge the demand in the right way, you gauge the capacity that you need in the right way, and then you make that kind of information available so that you make it less costly for each of the bidders to prepare and submit.
Maybe Professor Yunumba?
So let's see. Let me talk slightly about what Japan government has been trying to do to really promote PPPs at the local level, subnational level, to the smaller scale or smaller scale municipalities or smaller scale projects. One of the key elements is the simplification, because PPP usually takes much longer time to prepare. Standardization is a key, and also to make them less intimidated with the procedures that is required for the PPPs, say for value for money analysis, assessment, other things. So one of the key things that the government has been doing is the simplification of the procedures for the smaller scale PPPs or certain sectors, which can apply to basically replicated by the other agencies. That's like the first thing that the government's been doing. And also the government is asking the local governments of the certain sizes to consider the possibilities of PPP when they are making certain threshold of investment, so that they are not going to say, we don't know PPP, so we don't consider PPP. But let them consider PPP so that in the future, they may be able to really move forward with it. That's like the second thing, by policies that the government is trying to push them to do so. And also they are giving some incentives. It's kind of slightly going back to the first question of like financing issues, but the reason why the financiers are reluctant to invest in the smaller scale or low income countries are because they are not decently developed projects. The preparation is poor. And that's why the investors are not keen to invest into it. So that the government is now giving to smaller municipalities to do the feasibility studies. So like they have like a project development fund to give to the smaller scale municipalities to develop a decent project. That's another thing. And also they have certain grants to be used so that it's easier for the smaller project to fly. And then the lastly, the capacity building. Is a very unique activities that the Japan government is trying to promote amongst the nationwide municipalities, which is something we call it regional platform. That is consists of the local financiers, local governments, and also the local supply chains or industries to sit in one table to discuss about the potential of the projects and to really see how feasible this project might be, or who can be investing into this type of project, and also to create the opportunities for them to network each other, so that because like the PPP usually involves different sectors, different types of what do you call it, like contractors, operators, maintenance, whoever the industry that they may be coming into. But usually the local smaller SMEs do not know the other types of the industries, so that it is very crucial for them to have like those kind of network opportunities. And then one last thing I want to mention, that on data, it's not necessarily about the statistical data, but the data on like, especially at the local level, the local government should know what their local people really want. And that is someone was writing on the chat that the inclusion and also the participation of the general public, and they do not have that type of data, what exactly people want, what exactly people are expecting the local government to provide. And so those kind of collection of data and also scientific analysis of the condition of the region is quite important for the local governments to really putting the PPP programs together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Ziad, you have some comments?
Yes, thank you, Jacques. So, I wanted to actually forgive me because I've missed out on a couple of rounds. So if I may just answer several things or make several remarks on several topics. First, regarding incentivizing small-scale PPPs. I mean, I think that one thing that was not mentioned is actually government promotion of them. Having a specific government policy to promote small-scale PPPs and making sure that people and investors and everybody is aware of that. It's a little bit, it's like build it and they will come. If you don't talk about it, if you never say that we're interested in doing this, nobody's going to do it. So governments have to say, this is part of our program. We are going to do small-scale PPPs. The second thing is regarding the awareness that you are asking about. I think it's we cannot expect local government authorities to be experts on PPP or even to take CP3P certification. Certainly, we cannot expect even senior political decision makers in the countries to take CP3P certification. So we have to expect that the depth of knowledge of PPPs within government is always going to be very limited. Sure, there's a PPP unit, and sure, there's a staff of a PPP unit that know about PPP, but they are very small minority within governments. And therefore, you know, I think it should become part of the mission of PPP units to do training. PPP units should not just be there trying to do PPP projects. They should be actively training local authorities, even training business community, SMEs and others on PPP, so that these small-scale PPPs can have a chance of getting done and getting done properly and getting designed properly. Because if they're not, I mean, people then don't know how to do them. Also, part of awareness is to make sure that whatever documentation, and we have talked about template documentation being needed for small-scale PPPs to help local governments rather than reinvent everything from scratch, take standard documentation, boilerplate, fill in the blanks. Certainly, the legal aspects in most countries are the same across municipalities, across regions. You don't need to reinvent the documentation more than once. So that would reduce cost of project preparation, would help the local governments also, even with limited awareness, be able to do small-scale PPP projects. Related to that, I said that the mission of PPP units should not be limited to doing PPP projects, but also to raising awareness and educating on PPP. There's another thing that I think that national PPP units have to change about their mandate, and that is to start focusing on PPP programs as opposed to PPP projects. We need PPP units to think that they are responsible for programs where, you know, it's going to be, everything is going to be replicated and reused locally more than once, and not worry so much about the one project that they seem to spend years on and eventually may or may not happen because, you know, government changes or something. So I think the work of PPP units, national PPP units today is very inefficient. They are not acting in the best way that they could be acting. Finally, I think that in order to address the issue of small-scale PPPs being too small, we need to start, and this is the responsibility of governments as well as PPP units, as well as local authorities. They need to start looking at federating their efforts. So maybe one municipality is too small for a particular project, but a federation of municipalities in a particular region could then make a larger project more feasible. So if a city is 50,000 people, maybe that's too small for a waste treatment project, for example, that may need building an incineration facility, etc. But certainly if it works with the the 20 cities in its environment, to add, to make it a 500,000 population grouping, then a waste management program may become more feasible. There's a very good example of this in Palestine, on the West Bank, where various municipalities have teamed up together to create a waste management board, and it is staffed with professionals in PPP and professionals in waste management. And it is the board that actually is then contracting with private sector to provide the service. I can talk forever, so I will stop right here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ziad. I mean, very interesting talks. Maybe, well, Martin, you were the first. I mean, and then Ekaterina on this issue of capacity and expertise gaps. Martin, the floor is yours. I mean, you're probably on mute.
I must say, Ziad, I've heard you speak many times, and I've yet to find to hear a word that you've said that I have disagreed with. You know, your point about local government organisations forming federations for projects or programmes is exactly what we do in Scotland now, and that's brought the kind of minimum viable scale of our PPPs down quite significantly. You know, by building kind of procurement frameworks around groups of local authorities.
Yeah.
So, you know, so that's a really interesting point, one that I agree with 100%. And perhaps that's something, if we're going to talk about case studies in a future episode, we can unpack a bit further.
Indeed.
I mean, your other sort of central point was, you know, to try and cut local authorities a bit of slack. I mean, they've got around the world, they've got a heck of a difficult job to do. Almost all the public-facing services, whether it's school buildings or roads or waste, whatever it is, falls to local government. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not fair to sort of expect them to just suddenly spring a bunch of PPP projects that they know nothing about out the ground. And, you know, yes, sort of advocacy and capacity building. If the central government wants to do PPPs, it has to shoulder the responsibility for that capacity building within the public sector and equally within the private sector. And in fact, and forgive me for the minor digression, our firm, you know, my company, Caledonia Economics, actually started up because the founder was seconded to our financial unit within government to do exactly that back in the late 1990s. We were launching our PPP program. So him and one or two colleagues just spent weeks and weeks and weeks going around all the local government bodies explaining what it's all about. So yeah, so sorry, I'm not going to witter on. I think I totally agree with everything you've said, Ziad. It's capacity building, advocacy, standardization, and creating scale by federation. So,
Thank you, Martin. Ekaterina?
You know, it is very good to
Sure.
speak the last in the line because almost everything is already told. I will try to maybe point out a little bit different aspects because I believe there are not big difference between the data and knowledge necessary for development of any public investment project and PPP project. You, in any case, need to understand the economy of certain services, demand, condition of infrastructure, costs, risks, and it is a regular business of public entities. Main challenge here is to obtain the strong cost-benefit analysis skills and to have the reliable data, and we have the national solution for that. On the top of this basic knowledge, in the PPP case, we need to have the understanding how we can share the risk between two parties, and how it will affect the costs of proposals and potentially the value for money of the project, how the business models works, how the private partner financial flows are organized, and what extra costs could appear in case the private will take responsibility for the project. And here we, at least in our country, has a serious problem with public competence. And it is next to impossible for small municipality which have one or two excellent PPP projects to ensure the sufficient competence to deliver best value for the money and to protect the public interest. And here in this stage, we believe it is very important to have the support and involvement of strong central competence and standard approach, as was already mentioned. And in some cases, we're even overtaking some parts of the process, the critical moments of the process, or join the team and to support the public entity in the work of selection of the partners, for example. Also, in order to reduce the high demand of the competence, we're trying to prioritize the sectors where PPP could be applied. It is also can reduce the need for competence. You concentrate the limited knowledge there where you have the highest economic potential and you have the very good knowledge about the service. You can put the clear delivery standard, you can put the clear KPIs, and you can understand what you're trying to transfer to the public partner. And when priorities are set and we have the concentrated area for application of the PPP, here we can use for the best extent the standard procurement documents, the standard forms, whatever. We have it for all typical municipal projects. And also, as I mentioned, you can even join the process in the critical moments and support the municipalities.
Thank you, Ekaterina. I think we will discuss also the legal and technical challenges for preparation of these small scale PPP project. Nasser, you had a comment on this on this
yes,
gap?
I'd like, yeah, I think what Ziad was mentioning, that like for governments to look at a program rather than a project, I think is a very good way to go forward. I was involved in a project going back maybe 4 or 5 years ago where we developed a program for doing primary healthcare units. So I work in the social sector, schools, primary care clinics, and so on. Now, what tends to happen is that because everybody's incentivized to make the project bigger, particularly like if you have an IFI involved and they're all about how much private capital they mobilize. So whilst you may need only 2 or 3 schools in a locality, the minimum size project to make it worthwhile becomes like 40 schools or 60 schools. But then coming back to Martin's point on value for money, there's not much synergy between 50 schools that are dispersed all over a country. It's actually a collection of individual schools. There is very little. Okay, you might have HR as a back office support function. You might have IT, but in reality, when it comes to the more costly things like maintenance and so on that you need to incur over the years, and when it comes to the development cost, you are developing individual entities, individual units. So actually developing them as a program where you have off-the-shelf contracts that you can just simply sign, off-the-shelf tender documents, procurement documents that you can then take care of, then you can actually target the local contractors. You don't have to get internationals and so on involved. There could be 1 or 2 or maybe 3 schools in each of the localities. This is where you potentially need a big brother that can come in and take care and educate on the longer term risks that they would be taking in a PPP, maintenance and so on over a life of the life of the contract, the capital replacements. And this is where a national infrastructure fund can come in to actually be part of this, to take care of the things that the smaller local entities will not be able to take on board. That kind of takes a whole educational process forward with it. And it gets us away from this thing where PPPs are generally just misunderstood. They're just seen as this big mountain that nobody can actually climb. But actually, if you break them down to their simple components, they're not that difficult. They're not that complex. So I'm a big advocate of trying to make it small, make it simple, try to deal with it at the local level. You'll actually end up with less cost because then you don't have the margin on margin on margin that you'll end up with when you have the international developers come in. Of course, all the international developers on this webinar will hate me now, but we are talking about small PPPs.
You guys are fascinating because you're going faster than my questions. So, I mean, Professor Unumber, you raised your hand. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I agree with like what everyone has been saying, that it's very important that you try to make a scale of economy to do the PPPs. But at the same time, I would say that what we encounter, I came across with a very small project a small concession. It's like 20-year contract, but only $10,000 contract. So like a small scale PPP can be that small in this country. And so sometimes like trying to make it larger with, as Nasa just said, that the maybe just all these programs that just making it larger or making it the what they call scale is going to attract more international or like nationwide contractors that would kind of prevent the local, let's say, councilmen to agree on that project, and that is become another obstacle of pushing forward a smaller scale PPPs. And we also need to have the local politician on board to push forward the project. And for that, we really need to include the local enterprises, local small medium enterprises, and the local supply chain to be really contributing into the project. And that's the another key element of the small scale PPPs. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Ekaterina, you raise your hand.
I think I'm third in the line.
You're third in the line. No. You're
Again, okay, thank you.
next one.
David Dodd is David Dodd.
I think
David
David was earlier, yes.
Yeah, David?
David?
So let's continue, Ekaterina, and we'll try to read David.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Katerina. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Concerning legal and technical preparation challenges, of course, from one side you have small projects, which means smaller risk, relatively smaller financial commitment, and you can think about simplification of requirement and easier processes and rules for the project with a lower threshold for investment, and we're probably doing it in any country. But you cannot avoid the obligatory legal minimum procedure, but you can always make it easier, which was already mentioned by the pre-developed package, the support to the procedure and so on. But speaking about bundling or grouping the projects, unfortunately here we can face different challenges, legal and technical challenges, and they were already mentioned in the previous discussion. For example, it is next to impossible to bundle projects across the bigger territory, and especially with the different services. And you need to do a lot of homework before you think about PPP. You can look into the regulation of particular services in order to remove the barriers for optimization or combination of services. You also need to have a closer look to the regulation of municipal functions and financing of services in order to minimize the potential obstacle for federalization of joining the municipality to deliver the common services. We have a very limited experience. Only the waste management service is now bundled for the 10 bigger regions, and we have this legal environment for that. But it is a lot of potential and possibility to simplify the process if you put the analysis in the wide environment. For example, you look at the services and the level of city district, and you do not postpone the analysis of the data and economic and financial analysis to the level of the single project. At the single project, only you need to run the procurement. I can give you the short example of the Vilnius municipality. When Vilnius came to the need to improve the educational infrastructure across the city, there are 100 schools acting, and there are a number of schools needed to be constructed due to the new development. So Vilnius ran the integrated analysis of education infrastructure development bills, prepared the feasibility study to use the different delivery models depending on the needs and the scale and on the financing possibility, and then made the decision for which extent and where it can use the PPP model. We assisted them and also supported them with producing the standard school design, modern school design, in order to transfer it to the procurement document. And in this case, the costs and the risks of the project at the level of one school was very low. Everything was done, and a lot of job was performed in the earlier stages of planning and service analysis, so saving the costs and saving the time for the smaller stages later.
Thank you, Ekaterina. David, are you still on board?
I'm still on board. I'm still
Yeah.
here.
Go ahead.
I echo everything everyone else just said, and I at the risk of being called a dreamer, I still believe that we are in the infancy of the power of artificial intelligence to help streamline and make more efficient and less costly processes that are involved in putting together PPPs. I think standardization and the utilization of advanced AI is going to flip the script. It's going to change everything. And it may be more hype than real right now, but so is the internet. And if you go back to the 90s and think about how much the internet was hyped and it didn't get there right then, but it certainly is there now. We're using it right now. So please don't discount new technologies that have the chance to change the game, especially when it comes to transaction costs. The only other thing I have had experience with, again, this is an economic development. Many times, small SME, small medium-sized companies will come together and go together to the public sector and say, let's form a public-private partnership because we need this infrastructure, we need these services, and they're willing to pitch in, they're willing to invest, but they can do it because they're all together, and they tend to cluster in economic regions. So it's not like they're widespread all over the nation. They're in a specific region, and so that makes that more feasible.
Thank you, David. I mean, we've been through the technical preparation challenges, and thank you for that. But there is something I'd like to have you discussing about is the regulatory environment and the risk management. I mean, to make a small scale PPPs feasible, we need financial viability and we need effective risk mitigation. How do you think we could improve the regulatory environment and the risk management in order to make this small scale PPP project viable? Ziad?
Thank you, Jacques. As I will make only a brief comment on this. As Ekaterina was saying, you need to make sure that you make the changes to legislation, to regulation that are needed in order to enable a number of things related to small-scale PPPs. One change that's normally needed is to change the role of the PPP, national PPP unit, either by giving it additional powers to do programs or by adding awareness building and education to its mandate, or by limiting its mandate and giving more power to local PPP units, depending on the case. Every country is different. There needs to be some changes that are related to the powers of municipalities, to the powers of municipalities to do joint projects, to the powers of municipalities to form boards or form joint corporations with other municipalities, so that you have companies or boards that are in charge of mandating PPP programs and projects and signing contracts. The list goes on and on. I think we are going to have a special session on legislative and regulatory changes during this program that we have. So I'm sure in that session there will be a lot more discussion of these topics. But in case, since we are sort of have maybe less than 20 minutes left, I wanted to point your attention, Jacques, to some of the questions in the chat. I don't know if you've been seeing them, and also there's a good comment that Fatima Zora Rahmoun made regarding financing.
The question are in the chat, not in the.
Yeah, as some people have put them in the chat, But let me
Yeah.
read one comment that Fatima Zora made regarding financing, which I find to be very interesting, just because this session is recorded, and maybe in the recording people will not see the chat conversation. So she says we can explore innovative financing models such as crowdfunding, impact investing, or social impact bonds as potential sources of funding for small-scale PPPs. These mechanisms can help overcome financial barriers and mobilize resources from both public and private sectors. Certainly, crowdfunding may sound very strange to those of us who, have been in this field for a while, but young generation is very used to crowdfunding. A lot of projects are getting done. And certainly if a local municipality, for example, wants to do a project, especially if it is tech related, I think they will find a very interesting pool of funds from such sources.
Yeah, thank you, Ziad. I saw also a couple of comments from a Greek participant saying that in Greece they had a lot of experience, and I think that it could be useful to. I know we will have some case study. It would be useful to look at Greek small-scale PPP project. I would like to, I am trying to go through the question because I didn't see that the question were in the discussion and not in the Q&A, but it's not a big issue. There is an additional question about the accountability and transparency for small-scale PPP. How do we ensure accountability and transparency in small-scale PPP project, especially in the regions where governance structures may be weaker? Do you have any answer with respect to this point?
Sure. I mean, I think
Nasser,
in a way, probably no different to how else you would preserve transparency, effectively by being open and transparent. I think as long as you have a level playing field for those participants, as long as you are equitable in the way you're letting the market approach the opportunity, and as long as there isn't like hidden information, so there's a source of funding that's available to some but not all, that the government is behind, and I think you're able to preserve that. I think that the rules on transparency are vital if public procurement generally, not just PPPs, are going to be successful, and it's just very important to maintain that.
Who else want to discuss on this point?
Maybe I can have the short intervention here. Rather difficult to speak because country from country differs, and there are different approach and different regions rules in the country. We, for example, have the very strict rules and the very strong control on the PPP development. But just what we are doing, we're trying to follow the project from the early stage of the conduction of the cost-benefit analysis, and through the entire process, checking at any stage whether it is still delivering the social economic value. We check the first analysis, we check the procurement documents, selection documents, whether we're still in line with the project outcomes. We check the final draft agreement after the negotiation are over. So until the financial closure, we're strictly following the project, looking whether it still deliver the same financial value for money during the process. We would be happy to follow the project also during the implementation stage. And in this case, we do not have that good situation because there are some amendments, some changes, and sometimes we do not know what is happening with the projects until some scandals is happening or some problems is facing. So what we do in the country, we're trying to have this framework for overseeing the project during all the life stages in order to understand what's happening or what was the problems, for example, with the selection, which caused the later problems with implementation, and again to adjust the selection process for the next future projects. It's just our approach.
Thank you, Ekaterina. Professor Unamba?
Yes, I'm
You
just
raised your hand?
looking. Yes, for this type of questions, like we in Japan, that we are trying to, well, we are in a discussion with the government to kind of set up like some audit mechanism for the local governments, and at the same time, the local governments are not equipped to to do the long-term relationship or the partnership with the private partners, so that they need to have like a monitoring mechanisms as well, because they are not trained to do the monitoring of the private sector for longer term, so that there needs to be some kind of third party to provide that type of services. There are some industry discussions in Japan that, especially for, let's say, something like water sewer projects, that the national government and the some industry associations can create that type of monitoring services, so that even the smallest municipalities who do not have the expertise can benefit out of those kind of services.
Oh, thank you, Professor. I mean, Ziad.
Thank you,
Sure.
Jacques. Before we run out of time, I wanted, since this session is about solutions, possible solutions, I didn't want us to end without mentioning what some of our colleagues in the chat are talking about, the philanthropy side of things, as one possible solution for small-scale PPPs. Certainly, that is very important, as well as funding for NGOs to do projects. NGOs, as you know, are not for profit, but it doesn't mean that they cannot undertake projects. For example, I can give you a couple of examples from my country, from Lebanon. One is USAID funded a solar farm for a small town, and then then it handed it over to an entity that continued to operate it, but the seed funding came from basically an aid organization, and that can be very relevant to countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, this type of approach. And the last one is the idea of cooperatives. So there's another town in my country where the residents of the town got together through the municipality, but it's the residents of the town that financed the building of a solar farm for their town, and they all became shareholders, depending on how much money each one of them contributed. So basically, you ended up with a cooperative, really a company owned by the local residents. And this is yet another example for funding small-scale PPPs.
Thank you, Ziad, to highlight the role that philanthropy, NGOs, cooperatives could have in financing the small-scale PPP. I think it's a very important point. Will, do we have any other point you would like to raise? I mean, as we are reaching the end of this session. Martin?
Yeah, I'm just sort of scanning the questions in the chat here, and there's one from Fatima Zora, who I think actually had a question earlier that one of you picked up. But the question is, what advice would you give for communities looking to initiate small-scale PPPs? I'm just going to give you a bit of a tale from the road here. In the introduction, Jack, you mentioned that I'm chair of Tyree Renewable Energy Limited. And so that was a community-led initiative to develop a 1 megawatt wind farm. And when I say a community, it's an island that's 4 hours by boat from the mainland, with a sort of 500, 600 of a population, so it's pretty tiny. You can do it. Communities can develop PPPs, but it's a huge amount of work. When you're trying to raise, in our case, it was about £2 million, so at the time, probably about $3 million. You've got banks, you've got NGO funding, you've got rent agreements, you've got land issues, a whole ton of stuff. So yes, you can do it, and yes, it can generate a huge amount of money for your community. I mean, our wind farms put about £3 million into the community in 10 years. But it's a lot of work. So that's my closing comment.
Yes, Nasser.
But yeah, I agree, Martin. But I think there are mechanisms for kind of, how do you say, clubbing up together, so that, you know, if between the various communities that require a similar thing, they can club together and get a legal firm that can represent them all, and get a financial advisor to represent them all. You know, that's the kind of mechanism that you would be looking at. And I think this is, you know, when we're looking at solutions for how to get small PPPs off the ground. I mean, yes, if you club them all together into one single large PPP, provided there is an economy in doing that, then that can overcome it. But to the extent you can't, or because this is still funded at the or sponsored rather at the sub-sovereign level, it doesn't necessarily in some countries attract that governmental support, and therefore won't be attractive to the major developers. And I think there are other ways to do it. And I liked the idea that Fatma Zahra put forward about crowdfunding, because when you're talking about these kind of projects, they're actually very important to the community. And we all know, if you come back to schools and hospices and so on, there's a lot of people that just donate money to have a school built in their village. Now, if you can actually structure it so that it takes the form of a PPP, then what you're achieving is a sustainable solution. You know, what we see, and I go back to the school sector. In many countries, schools, you get donations, you'll build a school, within 5 or 6 years, it's leaking, the electricity no longer works, and so on, because there was never any money put on the maintenance side. And that just gets neglected. So if you can actually structure it as a PPP with a commitment from the developer to maintain it and service it over a period of time, then what you also have is a sustainable solution. And then whoever's putting the money forward is getting that benefit in a sustainable way. And instead of it being donations, it can become effectively equity into a project. So, you know, there are different ways to approach it. And you know, hopefully, as we get through more and more of these sessions, we'll be finding more specific modalities and mechanisms to deliver these projects.
Thank you all. Just before getting to conclusion and before ending this session, I was reading, and there's one good question from Fatima Zora that says, could you give us one or two advice that you can offer to communities looking to initiate participate in small-scale PPPs, especially in terms of overcoming initial order and how to ensure continued positive impact beyond the project implementation phase? I mean, I give you 30 seconds each, just if you want to finish before the time limit at 4 o'clock. Let's start. Ekaterina?
Okay, but I think that PPP is exactly the situation and the model to deliver this long-term impact, because this criteria for the impact assessment and for management of the impact, they're included in the procurement and in the agreement. You are not constructing, you are delivering the certain result and the certain impact in the long terms. So in this sense, I think that when we have PPP, we have this solution.
Thank you, Ekaterina. Professor Yunumba, you may be on mute.
Yes. One of the ways for the communities to make sure that their impact can be guaranteed over the time is to create as I was talking about, like a monitoring mechanism, and then like also including the community leaders or community stakeholders to be included in this type of monitoring mechanisms, and also to set up some type of workshop that with the operators and communities can discuss, because sometimes like the community, what do you call it, the impacts that they were looking at in the beginning, initial stage, and then the later on, 20 years later, can be totally, completely different. So that it's a continuous process that there need to be some kind of system to be built into it to discuss on these kind of, to make sure that the community impact is guaranteed over the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Martin, a couple of words?
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of the question that Nasser and I were trying to address kind of in the last wee round there. But I mean, I think my central point is that, you know, we all talk in quite lofty terms about community engagement and community participation and community initiative and these kind of things. But we just always have to remember that people in communities are busy people. They've already got full-time jobs and families to look after and so on and so forth. So, you know, while community-led projects led by community impacts, terribly important, they ain't going to happen with a lot of support, both in terms of capacity development and in terms of, you know, just the kind of delivery infrastructure from government in some shape or form, whether that's a PPP unit or local government or central government or whatever. You know, communities, in my view, don't have the capacity to develop major projects simply because they're busy people with busy lives.
Yes, I understand the involvement point. Nasser, then David and Ziad will terminate with you. Nasser?
Yeah, I think we go back to the same thing, that if you're trying to deliver a small PPP using the same method as delivering a large PPP, you're going to fail. You're going to run out of money before you know it. You won't find a market that's interested out there. So you really need to put the model on its head and look at it very differently. And you need to streamline every single part of the process. You need to look at a different supply base. And in looking at that different supply base, you have, you know, by definition, having to go through an educational process to show your supply base that it's not as difficult as they imagine, and it is actually possible to come into this type of contractual arrangement and deliver and, you know, make good money, deliver great value, create some sustainable asset or service which can serve the local community.
David, from where you are?
My appearance has finally gotten back to normal, just so everyone knows what happened to me. I had an allergic reaction, and my bottom lip was about 10 times its normal size. So just so everyone knows, I just echo what everyone said, and I tell my dear friend Fatima Zora to follow her own advice. She had some great ideas. Crowdfunding is, as Ziad said, for the younger generations, crowdfunding is absolutely viable. And then looking at impact investment, ESG investment, and foundation funding. I think putting those together in different ways could in a streamlined process, as everyone's already said, could really solve some of these major issues with small PPPs.
Thank you, David. Ziad?
Jacques, I would just end by thanking everybody for their interest in small-scale PPPs, for making this session so interesting. And I think we have a very interesting program. I encourage everybody to continue to follow it. And thank you very much, Jacques, for moderating today's session. Very kind of you to have taken the time to lead us through that.
Thank you very much to all of you. I mean, the contribution has been very useful. I mean, you had great ideas, great advices. And well, Ziad, I just want to say that the next session will be held on March 1st at the same time. And during this session, we will deal with what has been tried and what has been successful in developing small-scale PPPs. And we have another interesting set of sessions, and that's a great initiative from WAP. Thank you all.